Okay, so this next video lecture is still the continuation of our Module 4 CVP analysis. So we are now in the break-even point in units computation. So here, break-even analysis in economics, business and cost accounting. This refers to the point in which your total cost is equal to your total revenues. So basically, in this level of sales in units and revenues, there is no profit nor loss. Okay, so again, your cost is just equal to the level of revenue. So at break-even point, or this break-even point analysis, this is used to determine the number of units or peso of revenues that is needed to cover the total cost, which is your fixed and variable costs. Okay, so here, break-even point is also useful to determine what level of units the entity should meet, okay, so that they will not incur any loss at all. Okay, so this is the minimum level of sales in units or in revenue for them to be able to meet their total costs. Okay, so if the entity desired or desires to have a profit, then they should achieve greater than the break-even point in units or in revenue. Okay, so that they will generate a profit. But again, below break-even point sales in unit or revenue, so that the result will be a loss for the entity. So that's how break-even point also is being used. Okay, so we have here an illustration. Okay, so number of units, okay, or revenue, so that is equal to your total variable cost and fixed cost. So this is break-even point, okay, in an illustration. Okay, so what is the formula now for solving your break-even point in units? Okay, so BEP or break-even point in units, so this is equal to, just like what we have presented in the first video lecture, the example there, if you could still remember. So this is equal to the fixed costs. We will divide this by the contribution margin per unit. So how do you compute your contribution margin per unit? So this is the difference between sales price per unit minus variable costs per unit. Okay, so again, break-even point in units is equal to fixed costs divided by contribution margin per unit. So that is what we will follow. So fixed cost again, so this is just a short recap. So these are costs that do not change with varying output. Okay, so example of this is the salary, rent, building, and machinery. So it does not depend on the level of production, I mean. While your sales price, of course, this is the selling price, okay, per unit of product that the entity is selling. Variable cost is the cost, okay, that is incurred to create a unit or product, or in other words, variable costs are costs that follows with the number of units that is being produced. Meaning, if there is no production, no variable cost will be incurred. But if there will be a production, then there is variable cost, okay, that will be incurred. While our cost or contribution margin per unit, on the other hand, so this is the difference again between your selling price per unit and your variable cost per unit. This is your contribution margin per unit. So these are the elements of the formula for our break-even point in units. So to understand better, we have here an example. Okay, so we have here one example, I think. Okay, so Colin is the managerial accountant in charge of Company A, which sells water bottles. So he previously determined that the fixed cost of Company A consists of property taxes, a lease, and executive salaries, which add up to a total of 100,000. So the variable cost associated with producing one water bottle is 2 per unit. So the water bottle is sold at a premium price of 12. Okay. So to compute your break-even point in units, so following our formula, fixed cost divided by contribution margin per unit. So this is your fixed cost based on the problem is 100,000. Okay, so we will divide it with the contribution margin. So your contribution margin per unit again can be determined by deducting from the sales price of 12, okay, our variable cost per unit of 2 pesos. So basically, your contribution margin per unit is 10, okay, or that's simply 100,000 divided by 10. So your break-even point in units is 10,000 unit. Okay, meaning if the entity will be able to sell 10,000 units of water bottle at this level of units of sales, their total fixed cost and variable cost is just equal to their revenues. So at this level, they will have no profit nor loss. What about if the entity will sell 9,000 units? So the result will be a loss because what they achieve is below break-even point. What about if the entity sold 11,000 units? So in this case, they will have a profit which is equal to 1,000 units of water bottle. Okay, so again, if the entity will sell more than the break-even point, then it will result into a profit for them. Okay, so that's how break-even point is used in analysis. Okay, so therefore, given the fixed cost, the variable cost, and the selling price of the water bottles, so the company would need to sell 10,000 units of water bottles to break even. So to check if indeed, okay, if the entity will sell 10,000 units of water bottle, if there is no profit or loss, so we will check, okay, if that is correct. So to check if the resulting break-even point is correct in units, so we will prepare an income statement, okay, using the contribution margin format. So this is what I am talking in our previous video lecture. So compared with your usual income statement. Okay, so here under the contribution margin format, what we will do is to classify your cost according to variable and fixed costs. Okay, so using this format, so we have here our sales. So 10,000 units times 12, which is your selling price. Okay, so your total sales revenue is 120,000. Okay, so we will deduct here variable costs. So your variable cost is equal to the 10,000 units sold times the or the variable cost per unit, which is 2. Okay, so your total variable cost is 20,000. So if you will deduct this sales or this variable cost, I mean, from your sales, so the result will be our contribution margin. So that's 100,000. And our fixed cost, we will also deduct it, and it's also 100,000. So if you could see here, at 10,000 unit sales, there is no profit nor loss. So this is actually a break-even sales in units. Okay, so that's how to check if indeed your break-even point is correct. So interpretation. So the point at which the total fixed and variable costs are equal to the total revenues. This is what we call break-even point. So at break-even point, the business will not have a profit nor loss. Therefore, our break-even point is often referred to as no profit or no loss point. Okay, so your break-even analysis is important to business owners and the managers in determining how many units or revenues they need to cover their fixed and variable expenses. So therefore, the concept of a break-even point is as follows. So the first one is there is profit when revenue is greater than your total cost and fixed cost. Of course. Second, there is break-even point when your revenue is equal to total variable and fixed cost. Of course. Okay, so your revenue is just equal to your total cost incurred. So meaning there is no profit nor loss. So that is your break-even point. And the third is there is loss when the revenue is less than the total variable and fixed cost. Of course, if your revenue is less than your cost, then the result will be a loss. So this is how to interpret your break-even analysis. Or simply, if the entity sells at break-even point, there is no profit or loss. If the entity sells more than or greater than the break-even point, then they will have a profit. If the entity will sell less or below than the break-even point, then they will have a loss. Okay, so that's how you interpret the result of your break-even point analysis. So this is for the break-even point in units. What about break-even point in revenue? Okay, so we have here, actually, for break-even point in peso or revenue analysis, the formula is just the same with that of the break-even point in units. But the difference here lies in the denominator, because in this case, we will use the contribution margin ratio. Okay? So again, break-even point in peso or revenue, this is equal to fixed cost divided by contribution margin ratio. How do we compute or determine your contribution margin ratio? So this is just the ratio of your variable or contribution margin, with your total sales. So you can compute it by deducting from sales per unit your variable cost per unit. So the result will be your contribution margin. And then after that, we will divide it with your sales per unit. So that's how you compute it, or simply contribution margin divided by sales in total. So that's your contribution margin ratio. Okay. So we also have here the elements again. So fixed cost, again, these are costs that do not change or vary with the output. Your sales price is your selling price per unit. Variable cost is the cost that is incurred once there is production. So it goes along with the production. Okay. So contribution margin, again, or ratio, contribution margin ratio in this case is the difference between selling price per unit and variable cost per unit, which is expressed in percentage. So again, this is contribution margin divided by your total sales. That's how you get your ratio, CM ratio. Okay, so to understand better, we have here an example. Okay, so again, Company A, they sell water bottles. So they previously determined that the fixed cost is equal to 100,000. Variable cost again is equal to 2 per unit, and the selling price is 12 per unit. So to determine your break-even point in terms of revenue, so this is equal to fixed, or following our formula, fixed cost divided by contribution margin ratio. So your fixed cost is 100,000. So divided by contribution margin ratio, so this is computed by deducting from selling price of 12 your variable cost per unit of 2. So the result is contribution margin of 10, and then we will divide it by the selling price of 12, or that is equal to 83.33%. So again, 100,000 divided by 83.33%. So the break-even point in terms of revenue is 120,000. So meaning this is the level of sales revenue that the entity should meet in order for them to break even. Okay, so therefore, given the fixed cost, variable cost, and selling price of their water bottles, so the company needs to sell 120,000 worth, okay, of water bottles for them to break even. So to check again if our break even in revenue is correct, so we will prepare an income statement using the contribution margin format. So this is sales of 120,000. So this is sales of 120. So this is from your break-even point. Less variable cost. So variable cost is, in this case, you do not, for example, you did not know how many units was sold. So what we will do is to get the variable cost ratio. So how to determine your variable cost ratio? This is simply dividing your variable cost per unit by by the selling price per unit, I mean. So that's why 2, which is variable cost per unit, divided by 12, which is the selling price per unit, that is our variable cost per unit. Okay, and then we will divide it by 120,000, which is the sales. So this is again the variable cost ratio is the amount of variable cost that is related to the sales. So we can get your variable ratio because, as mentioned, variable costs are following the number of units. Okay, so that's why we can refer that from our sales. So again, variable cost per unit of 2 divided by selling price, okay, of 12. So our variable cost per unit is 16.66 or 16.67 percent. Okay, so we will multiply it with the sales of 120 to get your total variable cost. So that's 20,000. So sales of 120 less your variable cost of 20,000. So your contribution margin is 100. And then we will deduct the fixed cost, which is also 100,000. So in this case, your 120,000 level of sales revenue is actually your break-even point because at this point, you have no profit or loss. Okay? So what if we graphically represent your break-even point analysis? So actually, you can do that also. So using this illustration right here. So we have for the number of units in the in the x-axis, and then in the y-axis we have the dollars or level of revenue or in peso. Okay, in our case. So if you could notice, the revenue is in blue line. Your total cost, which is your variable cost plus your fixed cost, is in the yellow line. And then your fixed cost is in the red line. So where is our break-even point right here? So break-even point is the point where your revenue line meets your total cost line. Okay? So you can notice right there, your break-even point is pointing at the intersection between the revenue, color blue line, and the yellow line. So that is, in terms of dollars, so that's equal to 120,000. And in terms of number of units, this is equal to 10,000 units. So this is just the same as what we have computed in the break-even point in units and break-even point in revenues. Okay, so we just graphically presented it in this graph. Okay, so again, your fixed cost does not change. Okay, so we also have there the explanation. Okay, so those are for our computation of the break-even point in units and revenue.